all the speakers to kindly adhere to the timings indicated to them, which is 20 minutes for each presentation. Thank you for your cooperation. I am delighted to introduce to you our next speaker. Lieutenant General C.A. Krishnan is a former Deputy Chief of the Army and a former member of the Armed Forces Tribunal. As the Deputy Chief, he was responsible for perspective planning, financial planning, and capital acquisitions programs of the Indian Army. He has been on the board of directors of Bharat Electronics Limited and Bharat Dynamics Limited. He is a prolific writer on subjects such as strategic issues, rare earths, and space mining, among others. He also serves in an advisory capacity to defense industries as well as entrepreneurs contemplating entry into the defense manufacturing arena. It is a privilege to have you with us, sir, and without further ado, I hand it over to Lieutenant General C.A. Krishnan to speak to us on the topic, Perils of China's Dominance in Global Rare Earth Supply Chain and India's Fleeting Opportunity. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Perfect.
sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the very outset, it's my privilege to be part of this event on rare earths and to share this platform with such distinguished panelists. And let me thank Mr. Heplikar, Mr. Kishan Verma, Mr. Shashi Nair, Professor Bimal Patel, and their respective organizations for organizing this event and for having me on the program. Ladies and gentlemen, coming straight into the subject, Mr. Nabil Manchari and Professor Bimal, they have given us an exhaustive insight into the world of rare earths, which has made my job and the job of people to follow much easier. I will avoid repetition and confine myself to elaborating certain very important aspects of REs, rare earths, to give it an Indian perspective. And especially as we look at India in the coming 2 to 3 decades, and thereafter, in the end, I will round it up with a very brief peep into the Indian mineral industry for a holistic understanding. Now, on to this, I must just give a little wording to start with. Sometimes these slides do hang a little, so bear with me if that happens for an odd extra minute or so. The annual production as of 2020 was 240,000 metric tons. We will not go into who produced what. I will only try to emphasize on one aspect. The largest ocean liners which are in service today, they carry about twice this amount in one lift. So the quantity of the upstream mineral resources of rare earth which we are talking about is just about that much. Whichever countries, these are the rare earth reserve. There is nothing much to talk about. You are all aware of it. We also have, the Japanese, some findings of rare earths. Fortunately, it's on their eastern coast. Otherwise, China would have drawn another dashed line to probably claim that also. But this resource is at a depth of about 6,000 meters. So even for the Japanese, the technology to tap this finding from 6,000 meters depth will take a few years. Now, it'll be interesting. I've talked about quantity, which is about 240,000 metric tons. Let's look at rare earths, the entire mineral industry from the point of view of the global mineral industry as a whole. In 2016, the top 20 countries in the world produced minerals worth $1,375 billion. And coming to 2019, just the top 40 global mining companies, their revenue was a whopping $700 billion. Now, let's just superimpose the rare earths into this. The annual upstream mineral cost of rare earths is about $4 to $5 billion, which doesn't look very significant, nor does the quantity look insignificant the way I touched upon initially. So despite this, we are all talking about rare earths. The whole world seems to be talking about rare earths. And the simple reason is that today it has application across industries, whether defense industries, strategic industries, consumer industries, space, petroleum, everything. And it is required in smaller quantities, but it is irreplaceable as of now. There is no substitute, and therefore the criticality of rare earths. The that is just a spectrum of industries which use it, from fighter jets to ballistic missiles, laptops or mobiles, ceramics, nuclear reactors, green technology. The single largest use, as already brought out very beautifully, it is the powerful, lightweight, miniature application everywhere, whether it's a car door's window, or whether it is a laptop, whether it is a a vibrator in the mobile phone, they all use it, or whether on a wind turbine. Now, what is most significant is the dependency on China, Mr. Nabil has brought about. But one thing I would like to emphasize is, till 80s, the United States had the monopoly. How did it change to China? Of course, China had the predominant resource, advantage, but that wasn't the reason. The reason was environmental concerns and the dubious means, the mostly unfair means which China used to arm twist even the downstream industries to ship base into China. So he's explained to us how it came about. The monopoly shifted from US to China. But what is significant is, the monopoly is so pronounced today that a few years back, United States realized that for their frontline F-35 fighter aircraft, for every single aircraft, it required about 400 kilograms of rare earth mineral sourced from China. And that is the kind of dependency on China, even for defense industries or strategic industries. Now, at this stage, I want to step aside from rare earths and take a look at India. How do we see the next 2 to 3 decades? Whether it is GDP or our per capita GDP in the next 2 to 3 decades, we are looking at, and without hesitation, one can say we are on track for a jump, 4 to 5 times jump in our GDP as well as in our per capita GDP. Now, what does this translate into? Now, this translates into certain economic development indicators. I will request you to focus on the figures which I have given opposite India, that is in red markings. Look at the first two columns. That is, the first one is, the second one is the total carbon emission as a country. We are already up the world. But now this needs to be viewed in the context of the next 4 figures. Those are all per capita figures, whether it is per capita GDP, per capita electricity consumption, energy consumption, or the per capita carbon emission. Look at our figures, compare it to the others. We are at the rock bottom. So as we visualize or we aspire for in the next 2 to 3 decades for our GDP and per capita GDP to go, these figures will all do a corresponding 4 to 5 times. Now come to the first figure again, like total energy consumption of our country will have to go up 4 to 5 times. There is no other way, or well-being of our people without doing this. So naturally, if the energy consumption go up, the total carbon emission too will go up. But can we afford to do that? Can we afford our total carbon emission, which is there on already, to go up by about 4 to 5 times? The world will not let us do that. Even if they do, will we do that? We cannot afford to do that, because we'll actually be destroying our planet. So what is the way out? We have to do the 4 to 5 fold jump. That remains an imperative. There is no that is not negotiable. So what is the only way out? The only way, ladies and gentlemen, is to go in a big way towards efficient, modern, high-tech industries, and also in a big way go for green technology. Now, that is the only way we can achieve. We are not looking at a century ahead. I am talking about just 2 to 3 decades ahead. Now we need to introspect. Are we really doing something about it? Let's take a look at that. Yes, in one of the segments, that is electric vehicles, we seem to be, at least our vision seems to be on the right track. The vehicles on road today, about 200 million two-wheelers, 40 million four-wheelers, these numbers are all set to double by 2030. And we have very ambitious targets for going electric. 30% of our entire vehicle fleet by 2030. But what we need to understand is this is our vision. Now, to put this vision, actually translate it into action, you are very heavily dependent on the rare earths. The reason being, for every electric vehicle is so heavily dependent on rare earths. See the number of components which are dependent on rare earths, ladies and gentlemen. In particular, the most critical component of an electric vehicle are the electric motors. There are about 25 subsidiary motors and one main motor. All of them, they will go nowhere without rare earth. So that is one aspect we must keep in mind. The second segment is the wind energy. The wind turbines, the modern efficient wind turbines, which are very efficient, high yielding, lightweight, which require very little maintenance. They require to the tune of about 200 kilograms of rare earth material for every megawatt capacity of the wind turbine. So if you have a 10 megawatt capacity wind turbine, you need about 2 tons of rare earth material for each of these wind turbines. Now, let's take seeing the Chinese monopoly in rare earth and the dependency of rare earth on clean energy. Let's look at one segment of clean energy which is not dependent on rare earth, and that is the solar. Now, see again the monopoly of China. 71% of global solar PV modules in 2019 came from China. So, it is not just rare earth. It is almost near total dependency on clean energy. Now, take your mind back to what I said. In the next 2 to 3 decades, if we have to take 4 to 5 times jump, we have no alternative but to go totally clean and be dependent on the industries, the green industry. Now, the solar monopoly of China followed exactly the same script as the rare earth story. In 2000, 2004, US was the predominant solar manufacturer. Just see where the white line, that is the Chinese line, the blue line is the US line, where they have actually where each one of these have gone in the next 15 years, starting from 2004, 2006. The bottom line is that for green energy, there is a very high dependency, very high supply risk for rare earths. We need to keep that in mind. Now, let's take a look at the industries, the modern high-tech industries other than clean energy. For example, let's take the mobile devices. There are 7 billion devices in service today. The annually sold mobile handset of 1400 million devices. Each one of them carry a little bit of rare earth in it. So, and here is the spectrum of modern high-tech industries which run very high supply risk of rare earths. So whether it is green technology, defense strategic, fuel cells, robotics, drones, ICT, entire ICT industry. So, it just emphasizing and re-emphasizing the point that no country may be able to go anywhere unless we focus on these issues. Now, with so much of dependency, is the world waking up? I'm definite that we are not the first ones to understand this, nor am I the first one to flag this in a webinar or a seminar or to the respective governments. The answer is that the world is certainly waking up to it. At least the major stakeholders in the world are. Like the United Kingdom has set up its first RE refinery. Concentrates are coming from as far away as Tanzania, the raw material, and it is being done with the help of an Australian firm, Peak Resources. There is a REPM project being, the permanent magnet project being put up by the British government. This is with a company called LCM London. Incidentally, it may interest you to know that there is an Indian company which has controlling stakes in LCM London. That is just besides the point. EU is again into RE and REPM manufacturing. They have set up the process. There is a combined monazite based. It should be of particular interest to India because it is monazite based. EU and US, the Canadian firm is Neoperforma Material, and the US firms are Energy Fuels and Chemours. Now, the others too, US is into it in a big way, whether it is actually reviving their old processing facility or jointly with America's Lena's firm, or through regulations in the form of Defense Authorization Act, which bans use of Chinese permanent magnets in the defense products. Canada again is setting up a monazite-based rare earth permanent magnet facility. Australia and Japan are already well up. So all the major stakeholders, in particular the Quad members, are all into it. They are all busy. They are all well into it and making good progress. Though there's only one major stakeholder who is missing from action, and that happens to be us, India. Now, why is it? It's a very strange phenomena. We are doing so much in everything else. Why aren't we doing so much in rare earth? Is it because of lack of resources? Or is it because of our incompetent policies over 75 years? Or is it because of fear of corruption of illegal mining? Or is it because of fear of environmental degradation? Now, ladies and gentlemen, as we go, we'll touch upon, see some of these aspects. India is blessed with monazite resources in the form of beach sand minerals. We have one of the largest deposits in the world in the form of beach sand minerals. Beach sand minerals has the advantage of composite mining. Mr. Nabil Manchari explained to us in great detail as to how China is undercutting the price. Now, therefore, mining in isolation, actually, very difficult to make it economical. Here we have a situation, the resource that we have has a tremendous advantage of composite mining. And what is that? Beach sand minerals is the source for many extensively used heavy minerals in the industry called ilmenite, zircon, garnet, etc. So after extracting these from beach sand minerals, what is left is a monazite deposit, which contains rare earths and thorium. And imagine it contains thorium, which is a very important component of our three-stage vision for nuclear energy. So unfortunately, because of our inhibition, whether it is fear or wanting to preserve the thorium or the hesitation in storage, we have totally blocked this route of the monazite mining and making use of rare earth. We have in fact stopped mining the entire beach sand mineral, ilmenite, zircon, garnet, etc. Even those are being imported now. This is actually a very sad state, and we need to get over this. So where are we today in rare earths? Our monazite resources, as I just touched upon, remains unexploited. Would you believe it? I have a large number of mining friends. We have the capacity to produce. India has the capacity to produce, in conjunction with a lot of friends from Australia and UK who are willing to join up with India to produce rare earth permanent magnets in India in a matter of 2 to 3 years. And we have dead stock of monazite containing rare earth to the tune of thousands of tons held in concrete storage tanks along our eastern coast. This is a fact, ladies and gentlemen. We don't even have to mine. They are readily available. So they are lying unexploited. We have no downstream rare earth industry worth the name. What are we as of now? We are a low value downstream material supplier in the rare earth industry. This is despite the fact that we have had adequate signals in the recent past in the form of, we know the API monopoly and how it actually can arm twist the entire pharma industry, which is one of the strengths of India, pharma industry. But they are at the mercy of API. You all know what it is. I will not go into it. Semiconductors. This is a very recent phenomena. Do you know, you go and book a car today, not just the high-end car, any car, the dealer will tell you, give you a delivery date of 6 months from today. Why? Not because of any shortage except semiconductor shortage. That is the kind of effect which an upstream component can make, and that is what we are looking at. We will go nowhere in going green, nowhere in carbon emission reduction unless we wake up in time. Covishield ingredients, we have again seen what people can hold us to ransom. And the latest warning, very loud warning, is the EU's carbon tax proposal, ladies and gentlemen. You know what EU has proposed and what this holds for us. Now, if this is the situation, what do we need? We need focused policy without delay. Now, without delay is very important, most critical. The reason being, once the downstream value chain, downstream supply chain is established by countries coming together, like we have just seen, US, Australia, Japan, all the EU, nobody will have any time for us. We will not find it, we will find it impossible to make an economical entry or do anything at all with our monocyte resources. We need to do it without delay. We must involve private industries, foreign partners, joint venture, PPP, whatever model, and we must also start taking a lot of invest in the R&D. Now, therefore, what do we need? Actually, there is a silver lining in all that I have said. Most of our problems have very complex, intricate solutions with long gestation period. In the case of rare earth, it is not so. We have just a simple solution to this problem, and that is a bold policy decision. And the gestation period is almost zero. Now, for this policy decision, again, the silver lining is, at no point in our history we appeared in a better position to take strong policy decisions. Now, having seen all this about rare earths, ladies and gentlemen, the picture will be incomplete unless I put it in perspective by giving you a very short, very brief peep into the Indian mineral industry as a whole. India geologically is similar to resource-rich regions of the world, whether it is Western Australia, whether it is parts of Africa, South Africa, or parts of USA, Ghana, etc. But what does it relate into our exploitation of our mineral resources? It does not. Just see these figures. We produce only 1/7 of our mineral requirements. Imagine rest of it, 6/7 are imported, and look at the bills. Look at our Manipur, the mineral imports that we do every day, and compare it to what we produce domestically. Now, why is this so? To understand this in a layman's language, we'll have to take a very brief look at the chain, the flow chart of minerals. Right on top, we have mineral resources. It is established that we have good mineral resources. Next comes base survey and baseline geoscience data. Now, this is a general survey of what is being, an assessment of the mineral wealth of a country, a general assessment. Now, base survey and baseline geoscience data is done by the GSI, the Geological Survey of India. And you ask any miner, they will tell you the base survey, baseline geoscience data of India held by GSI is world class. notwithstanding a little scope for improvement in digitization, a little more digitization, and making the data, putting the data in the public domain. So if we have these two, we are well up. What is the next? That is exploration. Exploration is what actually connects the resources into proper mining. What once exploration actually fixes the location, fixes the value, the specific value. Once that is done, the government can issue license, policy, lease, etc., and the mining can continue. I must say a word about exploration here. Exploration is the prime mover of mining, ladies and gentlemen. It is an entity of its own. It's a very high risk proposition. Mineral exploration industry is referred to by miners as junior mining industry. And do you know something? Junior mining industry to mineral mining is what tech startups are to the IT industry. We see tech startups, sprouting all over the country. Most of them actually perish. But you have a handful of them becoming, unicorns and semi-unicorns. That is exactly the dynamics which the junior mining industry is supposed to provide for the mineral exploration. They are the ones who actually de-risk mining properties and look to be bought out. The success probability, do you know, of exploration is 1:100. That is why it's a very risky business which the government cannot afford to get into. No government can afford to get into. This exploration needs to be incentivized. We need to create an ecosystem through enabling policies for it. Unfortunately, the legacy that we are carrying, 75 years of policy burden, even with the changes, have actually blocked private players' entry into exploration. And so what has happened actually because of this? In 75 years, at the end of 75 years, what we have with sitting over, shall I say, a gold mine or mineral resource as a whole, we are grossly underexplored. Our mineral wealth is totally underexploited. Only 1.2% of our GDP comes from mineral mining. The major mining economies around the world, 5 to 6% of their GDP comes from mineral mining. And like I said, the data which is held by the GSI is not converted into commercial assets through exploration. Therefore, less than 10% of our total obvious geological potential area only has been subjected to detailed exploration. Now, as a fallout of this, conversion of geological resource into mineable reserves of India, we have an extremely poor, probably the poorest record in the world. And an indicator is we have 20 billion tons, 20 billion resource. But post-exploration, what has been established is only 2.5 billion tons, just about 1/10 of it. That speaks and that explains the huge imbalance of our domestic production versus imports. Finally, gentlemen, the miners have a very popular saying, the mineral industry people, that the meek shall inherit the earth, but not its mineral rights. Could you have thought of a better, point in time to say this than how it applies to our own case today? But there is a lot of light at the end of the tunnel. There is a way forward. We must be proactive, balanced, and we need effective policy approach, bold decision. And the gestation period is so short. If private players can be in defense industry, in space industry, even in India, why not in mineral exploration and monazite mining? This is a question we must ask ourselves. Why not? And as you have seen, no explorations go nowhere without private explorers. I will just elaborate it. Exploration, I have said, is too risky to scan government resources. The per square kilometer investment in Australia for exploration alone is $124. Canada is $118. India, it is as good as nil. It is just $9. Now, who will cover the gap? No government can do this. It has to be opened up for private. and it has to be incentivized and opened up for private investment. There are plenty of lessons. There is no secret. There are plenty of lessons. There are people prepared to join hands with us. All that we need to do is to learn lessons from advanced jurisdictions like Australia, Canada, and Ghana. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's all that I have. I hope I put across, in a different perspective, where we stand as far as rare earth is concerned, and in general, we need to understand this in the backdrop of mineral industry as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lieutenant General C.A. Krishnan, for your comprehensive and insightful presentation on the subject. A note to all participants, questions to all the speakers and panelists will be taken up in the question and answer session after the panel discussion. Our next speaker for the day is Mr. Manoj Kewalramani. Mr. Manoj Kewalramani is a fellow, China Studies, and the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Research Program at the Takshashila Institution. Mr. Manoj writes a weekly newsletter, Eye on China, that tracks developments in China from an Indian perspective, and a daily newsletter analyzing news coverage in the People's Daily. He is also the author of Smokeless War, China's Quest for Geopolitical Dominance, which discusses China's political, diplomatic, economic, and narrative responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. I now invite Mr. Manoj Kewalramani to speak to us on the topic, India's REE challenge, competition, resilience, and opportunities. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nisha. I'd like to thank the Chennai Center for China Studies, the Institute of Contemporary Studies, the Press Institute of India for organizing all of this and putting all of this together. It's been fascinating to sit back and listen to all the presentations so far. It's been a learning experience, I must say. But I must also add that there's a challenge going so late in any round of presentations on a topic, and there's an advantage. The challenge is that a lot of what you want to say gets covered. And the advantage is also that a lot of what you want to say gets covered. So you actually, a lot of people have made the points that you want to make. So your challenge is to probably make them make them as interestingly as you can. I'm just going to share my presentation if it's possible. 1 second. 1 second. Right. So. Oh, okay. So there's an issue with my presentation sharing. I'm going to try and see if I can just share it here. Just give me a second. The PDF is not being shared.
So if you like, one of us could share it from our end. If that
No, it's all right. I think I can share it through this mode. That should not be an issue. It's just a second, then I'm done. Okay. Okay, I hope you can see this now. Right? I hope you can see it.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so essentially what I wanted to talk about, and some of this has already been said, so I'm going to try and go very quickly through some of the bigger points that I wanted to make and then come to the recommendations as quickly as possible to try and stick to my time limit. I'm going to talk about the emerging policy environment. A lot of this has been said already, and India's opportunities and challenges, and then give out the recommendations. Essentially, this is how I see what's happening in the world right now. We've, and this is sort of pre-COVID, but COVID has accelerated some of these trends, right? We've seen the politicization of economic relations increasingly. Now, there's a sort of argument on all sides about who started this, but essentially the important point from an Indian perspective is that this is the reality of the world that we face today, where your international institutions and norms of governance are, if not breaking down, they're rapidly changing, and there's much more competition that's getting, that's the focus of economic relations today, and there's much more political competition. And that's going to be driving what we see going forward. So the rules-based architecture that we can talk about, we're sort of going to be less reliant on that going forward as states prioritize their own strategic interests far more rather than surrendering a certain amount of their sort of interest for the larger sort of cause of setting norms and governance standards. That's the first point that we need to keep in mind, and because that will essentially mobilize policy. There's a weaponizing of interdependence. This is happening across the board, and this has happened not just from a Chinese point of view, but also from others' point of view. And I mean, if I was to be absolutely value neutral, I would also see India's response to what's happened in Ladakh is essentially saying, look, we will also shift the game, we will also shift the dynamics to other domains of the relationship, because there are strategic and political objectives involved. Whereas the Chinese are arguing for the old model in that case, which suits them very well, of course. But this is happening across the board. The Chinese have done this for decades now, particularly since the mid-2000s, after they sort of acquired a certain degree of deeper gravitas and say in the international economic system. There's a resurgence of nationalism and populism across the world. We've seen this in the West, we've seen this in India, we've seen this in China, with Xi Jinping's rise and how that rise has taken place. And that again sort of fuels this idea of political logic, the political logic of your relationship being far more important than sort of economic arguments about comparative advantage and those sorts of things. And that's, I think, something that we need to be careful with, because this is also going to impact how your relationships develop with even trusted partners. Because, you know, in democracies particularly, we can see governments change, and, you know, populism and nationalism can sort of turn policies. So again, this is a risk factor that needs to be kept in mind. There's intensified competition over emerging technologies. I don't need to go into this. This is, you know, critical. It's across the board, and this particular session sort of clarifies this point. And there's a key concern with regard to supply chain vulnerabilities, which have gotten much more amplified after COVID. It's not like they didn't exist before, but I think sort of the disruption that the pandemic caused has led people to think more about these things. So the nutshell point in all of this is that economic engagement in the future is likely to be far more subservient to the logic of politics and security. And that's what we are seeing. We're seeing more states talk about expanding the definition of national security. Some of the presentations that we've heard so far also have mentioned the fact that at one point in time, I think it was Professor Patel who mentioned that we can use national security as a factor in terms of how we make our decisions going forward with regard to rare earth elements. So it just tells you that while we can do that, yes, the others are also doing that. And it's an increasingly legitimate tool that's being used. And that's going to have an impact because, and why I'm mentioning this is that from a strategic perspective, all of us understand this, but this has an impact on businesses. And when we are talking about private businesses and private business engagement, these are the kind of risk factors that they will keep in mind when they come to invest in rare earth sectors in India or elsewhere. So governments need to therefore keep this in mind when we are framing policy, because anything that is done abruptly can disincentivize, can create sort of long-term disincentives for private sector to play a role, which sort of presages one of my conclusions and one of my recommendations is that we need greater private sector participation, as was just said in the presentation before mine. In terms of the sort of emerging policy environment with regard to the US, again, Professor Patel spoke about the executive order that Trump had signed declaring an emergency, and he had also spoken about investments in mining resources at that point of time. And that's one part of US policy. But under the Biden administration, what we've seen is that the imperative of security and, you know, supply chain, closing down supply chain vulnerabilities are colliding with the environmental imperatives. And increasingly, there's reportage about how the US is looking at partners abroad for resources, for raw materials, rather than tapping raw material resources internally. And that's something that's important to keep in mind from our point of view also, that as the future supply chain that will emerge will not necessarily be, for the lack of a better word, Atmanirbhar for any country, or at least the concept of Atmanirbharta has to be far more diversified. It has to be of a supply chain that is interlinked probably among trusted partners much more so than has been in the past. And that's also the way the US is moving. So different states are trying to balance different trade-offs. And in the US, this is a important sort of trade-off with environment and security with regard to raw materials and raw material capacity. The other thing is that in saying that, the US is looking at processing capacity much more. There was a recent report talking about processing capacity with regard to EVs and, you know, building the EV sector in the US. And this is also linked to sort of high quality jobs. So that's the direction that the Biden administration seems to be going. After it sort of launched its, in February, it launched its supply chain review across different sectors, including rare earths. The third part is that they want to work on building resilience with allies. And I've already spoken about this, that you're trying to look at getting raw materials from abroad, which will probably mean greater investments. And again, it's something useful from our point of view also to keep in mind if we are looking to work with the US much more closely than we have in the sector. It's important to understand how they are shaping up, because those are also potentially assets that we can negotiate and work with on together. In terms of China, I think Dr. Manjiri gave a fantastic presentation, so I don't want to add too much to that. It was far more granular than what I'm doing here. But essentially, I want to talk about new regulations that were proposed earlier this year domestically, which talk about, limiting foreign investment. This is anyway a state-dominated sector at central and local levels. So the objective right now is to further limit foreign investment, which is to sort of cut down on capacity, which is again to meet multiple different objectives. One of the objectives being environment and sustainability, because that is a key concern from a Chinese point of view. And when they're looking at their sort of environmental objectives down the road, it's an important political goal also for Xi Jinping, and he's made it an important political goal given the sort of dynamics of domestic politics and populism in China. His adoption of so-called beautiful China as a strategic objective as part of his high-quality growth agenda is indicative that this is something that they will continue to do. The other thing is that in order to support that, they're also trying to sort of crack down on illegal trading, illegal mining, unplanned production. So they're trying to sort of bring what has been a wild industry to heel. And so far what we've seen is that the central government has not necessarily succeeded in doing that. I think in a lot of our conversations about China, we tend to ignore the fact that there is a center and local government push and pull that goes out and that plays out in Chinese domestic politics. And that's important for us to keep in mind, because often what we've seen is that the actual amounts of extracted rare earth elements and processed elements and exports tend to exceed what may be reported in China, which tells you a little bit about the mismatch between center and local governments in China. And the politics of it is that there is an effort to try and crack down as much as possible at the central level on local sort of efforts in gaining revenues from these. And that's also reflected in anti-corruption campaigns and so on and so forth. Therefore, these new regulations that were proposed in January this year, their approach is to try and expand control of the central government across the entire industrial chain. And that's something that's going to play out in the future, and the effort is to try and control it. And the effort is therefore to cut down on raw material generation, but rather focus on processing capacity, move up the value chain in that sense. And already, like Dr. Manjiri has said, that a lot of the processing happens in China, and the effort is to try and expand that and therefore become a key node in the global value chain, but also most importantly satisfy domestic demand, because this is again keenly linked to the central leadership's vision of China emerging as a manufacturing superpower in the future. So while all of us may assume that the path that China will take going forward is going from agriculture to a manufacturing powerhouse to now a service-driven economy, it's actually not necessarily what the plan is. The plan, if you look at the 14th five-year plan and the 2035 long-term plan, it's essentially looking at expanding manufacturing capacity and high-end manufacturing capacity based on sort of, driven by sort of new technologies and emerging technologies. And for all of that, you will need rare earth elements. And that's what they're trying to do. So even within the sector, they're trying to go up the value chain, and they're also hoping that that process will facilitate their manufacturing sector's upgradation, because that is how they see their future. They don't see their future as the United States as a financialized economy, but rather as something like Germany, which is a high-end manufacturing-driven economy. So that's some of the reasons. Now, I just wanted to share some graphics. I think all of us have spoken about this already, about output and production capacity. But this is an interesting chart which talks about Chinese exports and in terms of the value of those exports and what value is generated. And what we can see is that it's still the case that exports are declining, but there's been no significant change in terms of, even the value generation is declining from exports, but it's still not at where it was maybe 10 years ago. But it's heading in that direction, and imports. And 2018, China became an import destination. So this is the direction in which their industry is largely going, and I thought it's useful for us to know. In terms of what India's opportunities and challenges are, so I think the speaker before me spoke quite eloquently about what we are doing, and we import an overwhelming amount of our rare earth requirements from China, around 97% of them, the last I checked. Yet we aren't necessarily a large consumer of raw materials. We are a consumer of products that eventually comes down the road. So when we at Takshashila were thinking about how do we come up with a framework to try and understand what is critical products and where do we focus on, how do we sort of assess that, and why do we need a strategy to do all of this? What we essentially realized, and this is predominantly from a economic growth point of view, not from a sort of military national security perspective, this framework that I'm presenting here. Because if you were to put that framework, then your axis here, which talks about the importance of activity, would also take into account military uses. But we are looking at essentially, what is the likelihood of disruption in supply of certain commodities because of maybe the raw material supply being disrupted to us, or product supply being disrupted for us, or raw material supply being disrupted to other partners from whom we are importing maybe those products. And we looked at that and we came up with a list of different activities, products, sectors, which are far more important than the others, which tell us as to why it's important for us to focus on. And if you see on this axis, the importance of activity is defined from the point of view of what is the value added to India's GDP, rather than, the share in India's GDP, rather than just sort of from a national security point of view. And it tells us that, there's a significant component here, there's a significant component here, where likelihood of supply disruption might cause problems down the road, and this will even affect our exports. So it's really important from our point of view that we need a strategy to deal with rare earths. What are our opportunities? Again, I think the speaker before me spoke about monosites. We've got around 6.9 million tons of monosites, which is the 5th largest reserves in the world. Overall rare earth reserves. There's a tremendous number of monazite reserves. This chart here will show you exactly where a lot of this is located. It's important for us to start to exploit these. We've not exploited these as effectively, and the biggest challenge in doing that, like we said, was in terms of our policy architecture, but also in terms of the monopoly of REL. We need to be able to look at private sector participation far more seriously. At present, IREL's remit is essentially limiting the kind of extraction and exploitation that we can carry out, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. So therefore, some sort of changes are needed. The big challenges along with this is obviously the fact that it's extremely expensive, and it can be extremely expensive, so it requires tremendous amount of investment, and that's upfront investment to be able to do some of these things. The environmental effects, again, these have been spoken about in some detail, so I won't go into that. But I think it's again important for us to address this rather than ignore it, particularly when it comes to exploitation of monazite beach sand. Bottlenecks in production. I've spoken about this. The government holds effective monopoly over beach sand minerals, which contain lighter rare earth elements. And that's a huge problem from my point of view. We need to start to break down that monopoly. And finally, global competition, right? We are lacking behind other suppliers, and that's a challenge from our point of view to be able to become much more competitive, which will essentially, at the end of the day, this will incur significant costs, and there's no guarantee of recovering costs. So when you're talking about private sector coming in and investing, so while I agree that governments cannot do all of it, and we need private sector participation, but when we are talking about private sector coming in and investing, how do we make it viable for private sector to invest? Because it's going to take time to be able to build that capacity. So we had a bit of a framework here again, where we looked at lighter rare earth elements, which have high commercial potential. And we thought that, okay, look, let's try and see if we can focus on these to begin with, at least in terms of our extraction objectives. And we sort of ranked them in different sort of points of view from in terms of how long it takes, what is the gestation period, what is also the time period that it takes to extract them, what is the availability in India, and the strategic potential of all of those. And I can share this with everybody to go through rather than going with this in detail. So that's broadly what our thinking has been about how India needs to approach the sector. And based on that, we had a couple of recommendations, and I'll just quickly go through this set. The first, and this was mentioned by one of the previous speakers about how different countries have strategic stockpiles. I think it's important for India to consider strategic stockpiles. Since we are not necessarily importing raw materials as much and processing them here at that level, we maybe need to think of stockpiles differently rather than just looking at raw materials. We need to be looking at stockpiles in collaboration with trusted partners, because there is, of course, a cost also involved with all of this. And if you don't have capacity for processing, it becomes even more problematic. So it's important for us to think of stockpiles in a far more diversified manner than we did in the past. This will require developing political trust with key partners, whether it is Japan, whether it is the United States, whether it is Australia or other states. So that's one sort of idea in terms of how we think about strategic reserves rather than just thinking about something that we are stockpiling at home. We need private sector participation. This has to be a regulatory change, but it doesn't just have to happen at a regulatory level to start allowing companies and to reduce the monopoly of IREL, but it also needs to come from an economic point of view, where we are thinking of potentially a viability gap funding for private sector companies who may come to invest in this sector. Because at the end of the day, from a private sector organization point of view, gestation period matters, capital upfront matters, availability of capital matters, and therefore an incentive structure has to be thought about. And I think we should, when we're looking at the Chinese incentive structure that we just discussed earlier, it's important to think of, how we also need to create an incentive structure. It need not be industrial policy, but it needs to be an incentive structure to sort of support private sector firms with viability funding for them to work through. I've already spoken about working with trusted partners, but again, we need to possibly also look at investment from different parts of the world. Investment from the Middle East can be extremely important, and if we can actually work with countries in the region to try and get capital investment in the Indian rare earth sector by firstly loosening the shackles in the sector, that could be useful. So we need to be a little bit more creative in terms of how we're approaching capital acquisition. In terms of the environmental damages and the environmental challenges, I think the first thing that needs to be done is that there needs to be far better communication with regard to the fears related to monazite extraction. From the way I understand it, these can be overblown. And therefore, it's really important to actually have science-based communication and effective communication with regard to the real threats and dangers and the challenges, rather than, letting rumors, letting anxieties, perpetuate, and therefore you end up clamping down on activities for political reasons. So I think that's another important thing in terms of how we communicate with local communities. At the same time, we need to involve local communities through initiatives of sustainability. I don't think we can do this by fiat like the Chinese have done it. We can't, and even if the Chinese have done it by fiat over the decades, they have now come to a point where politically it is challenging to keep doing this. And that's a reflection in the acknowledgement of environmental sustainability goals from the Chinese point of view also. But in an Indian point of view, it's anyway been extremely difficult to do this politically because of environmental concerns. So it's really important to actually work with local communities, offer viable alternatives, offer opportunities for resettlement if needed, and do that with far more diligence than we have. A lot of our ills need to be addressed domestically to be able to have an adequate strategy in dealing with the challenges of Chinese dominance of the sector. The last and the most important point again with that is, and it again goes to domestic regulation, is that we need to make sure that our pollution control boards exercise effective oversight. So a lot of these fixes are at home. And if we can do that well, we can actually start to sort of deal with the challenges of Chinese dominance. It's not just about expanding capacity at home or importing. It is also about changing the way we are approaching the sector in terms of overall governance. That's just what I wanted to share. I'm happy to hear people's thoughts after this.
Thank you, sir. You have certainly opened our eyes to some of the underlying issues and opportunities that impact India's potential in the global rare earth market. With that, we move on to our next distinguished speaker, Colonel R.N. Ghosh Dastidar. Colonel R.N. Ghosh Dastidar is a retired mechanized infantry officer with a vast and varied experience in the Indian Army for 38 years. He's a keen follower of geostrategic events around the globe and a freelance journalist in this field. We are honored to have you join us today, Colonel Ghosh. I now invite Colonel R.N. Ghosh Dastidar to make his presentation on how China became the dominant player in rare earth elements.
Thank you. Good morning, folks. Most of what I have wanted to say has been covered, and I'll also try do my bit of value addition here. Rare earth is the new oil. Middle East has crude oil, but China has rare earth, is what Deng Xiaoping had said in 1992. In history, United States was the initial leader in producing and trading rare earth. United States discovered rare earth in mountain pass in California in 1949. Molybdenum Corporation of America started producing bastnaesite in this particular mine. It initially designed for the separation of europium, which quickly became an important element in making color televisions. Molycorp, as what molybdenum is known as, also extracted lithium, which is used in batteries, as has been earlier covered, cerium, neodymium for magnets, praseodymium, and scientists quickly began to discover new uses for these additional materials. Came in China, where in 1927, in Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia, rare earth deposits were discovered along with iron deposits. It contained bastnaesite and monazite. In 1960s, China also discovered bastnaesite in deposits in Shandong and in Sichuan. During the 1990s, its export grew rapidly, causing prices to plummet, a strategy that either put competing companies out of business or drove them out to greatly curtail operations. Bayan Obo is the world's largest mine. It is estimated to hold 48 million tons of rare earth oxide with an average grade of 6%. It contains close to 1 million tons of niobium with an average grade of 0.13%. In 2005, it accounted for 47% of the total rare earth production of China and 45% that of the world. In 1990s, Chinese government declared rare earth as a protected and a strategic mineral. Since then, efforts have been there to increase centralized control, create a higher market value, build supply chains inside China, develop technical know-how, and to attract foreign companies using rare earth to manufacture final products inside China. And this process is still continuing. Foreign investors now can participate in rare earth smelting and separation only as a joint venture with Chinese firms. Foreign investors are prohibited in mining rare earth. Chinese government took major steps to support its nascent rare earth industries by issuing export tax rebates in mid-1980s. The tax rebates lowered the cost of Chinese mining companies, which allowed them to gain a foothold in the global market. Between 1985 and 95, the Chinese rare earth mining production exploded from 8,500 metric tons to roughly 48,000 metric tons. And its share of global mining output widened from 21.4% to 60.1%. As the Chinese mining capacity expanded, rare earth producers in other parts of the world began to shift their production to China to take advantage of their country's low cost in labor and weak environmental regulations. If you see a breakdown of the global rare earth exports between 2008 and 2019, China has a share of 46.3%, US about 5.4%, Malaysia 5.4%, Austria 5.0%, and Japan 12.4%. 25.5% is that with the rest of the world. We come to the magnet industry and how China usurped it. In supply chain, China sought to first capture the magnet industry, magnet market. Today, magnetic technology is perhaps one of the most important use of rare earth, both commercially and militarily. Permanent magnets that utilize rare earth not only provide greater magnetic power, but they also are much smaller in size. The samarium cobalt magnet and the neodymium iron boron magnet are both two leading magnets in the world. They are particularly useful for military applications such as missile-guided systems because of their thermostability. The various applications in defense of rare earth are in communication, electric motors, guidance control, targeting and weapons, and in electronic warfare technology. The story behind neodymium iron boron magnet reveals the Chinese modus operandi is that it is an important indication that China by design attempted to corner the market for rare earth. When these magnets were created, two companies, General Motors and Hitachi, acquired patents. General Motors patented the rapidly solidified magnets and Hitachi the sintered magnets. General Motors established MagnaQuench, a company to produce the magnets. In 1995, two Chinese groups joined hands with a US investment firm and attempted to acquire MagnaQuench. US government approved the acquisition after the Chinese agreed to keep the company in US for the next 5 years. The day the deadline of US government finished, the company shut down its US operations, employees were laid off, and the entire business was relocated to China. The deal was a strategic mistake on part of US because when the business left, so did the technology. In 1998, 90% of the world's magnet production was in United States, Europe, and Japan. Within a decade, the bulk of the magnet industry moved to China. Chinese producers have turned their attention to Japanese companies thereafter, which held the majority of the rare earth magnet patents. In 2014, China took Hitachi Metals to court in the United States, claiming that after its patent had expired, Hitachi was creating unfair market barriers. China has consistently attempted to monopolize the rare earth resources worldwide. It attempted to acquire Molycorp and the Mountain Pass mine. In 1978 onwards, the company was owned by Unocal, the Union Oil Company of California. In 2005, the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation submitted a bid of $18.5 billion to purchase Unocal. The Chinese company outbid Chevron by $500 million. The CNOOC, as the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation is known as, its bid raised a concern in the United States about energy security, and the deal didn't go through. And by default, US managed to save the rare earth resources of Mountain Pass too. In 2009, China tried to acquire 50% stake in Lynas Corporation, which is the owner of the Mount Weld mine in Western Australia, which is considered the richest deposit of rare earth outside China. China terminated its $505 billion bid after the Australia's Foreign Investment Review Board put down its foot and stated that China cannot hold majority stakes and should not have more than 25% representation in the governing board of the mine. China did manage, however, to acquire 25% stake in Arafura Resources, which owns the Nolan Bore mine in northern Australia, which is again a very major source. China has major mining rights in many of the Belt Road Initiative nations, which are rich in rare earth in South America, Africa, and in Central Asia. The ramifications of the relocation of production to China resulted in the United States giving up its leadership position. The erosion of technical expertise which accompanied this relocation is now the major impediment for most of the advanced nations who want to now break the Chinese hegemony. In 1990s, the Chinese strategy began to focus on rare earth. Mines in other countries couldn't compete with the low cost of Chinese mining and processing. Relocation of major companies to China under joint venture and transfer of technology aided China to indigenize production of permanent magnets, oxides, and alloys. In 2010, China cut its export quotas of rare earth exports and rare earth prices skyrocketed. However, here in 2010, once it did that, it was taken to the court by US, EU, and Japan. And in 2014, they got a ruling against them. The Chinese exports in 2019 to Japan, 36%, US 33.4%, Netherlands 9.6%, South Korea 5.4%, and Italy 3.5% in volume. The metals and alloys in EU depends upon 98.5%. This has already been covered. USA 95.2%, South Korea 90.9%, and Japan 48.5%. Here we must make a mention of Made in China 2025 policy, which the Chinese government has adopted, which aims to indigenize core components and materials to 40% by 2020, that is the last year, and by 70% in 2025. It also drives the green development, use of innovation, and emphasizing quality over quantity. The Chinese decision to diversify countries' energy mix by including vast amount of renewables has made rare earth a key ingredient in the success of their green energy applications. Rare earth as a leverage. Today, China's dominance in rare earth element supply chain presents one of the most strategic vulnerabilities of the world, akin to the global energy crisis of 1970s. China has demonstrated willingness to leverage its influence in the global rare earth industry in pursuit of its political objective. Use of rare earth as a political tool came in 2010 over a dispute over in Senkaku Islands with Japan. China restricted rare earth export to Japan for 2 months. It came as a rude shock to the whole world and a wake-up call. Amid the US trade tensions, China threatened to cut off exports of rare earth elements to US. It hiked the tariff from 10 to 25%, and in October 2020, it put Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing on the sanctions list. In 1999, Jiang Zemin had stated, improve the development and application of rare earth and change the resource advantage into economic superiority. And that is what they have achieved. The future. Mining of rare earth materials outside China has been ramped up significantly. China's share in global mining production has slipped from 97.7% in 2010 to 62.9% in 2019. However, its share of global earth reserves of the rare earth reserves has also fallen from 50% to 36.7%. But its status as the main supplier of oxides, metals, permanent magnets has not been similarly diminished. In the future, Chinese domestic consumption of rare earth, which is growing exponentially in defense, electrical vehicles, mobile, robotics, renewable energy technologies will far outstrip its production, the demand from these. It has already become the world's largest importer in 2018. The global strategy to break the Chinese dominance. Advanced nations need to explore and exploit new resources of the rare earth energy ore. US, Japan, Germany, Australia are already funding new production sites. Space is the limit. Japan's Hayabusa 2, the space probe on an asteroid, Ryuga, which landed in December 2020 in Australia, brought back samples of Earth in search of it in space. Advanced nations need to establish midstream and low downstream production facilities. The world needs to find an alternative material to rare earth elements, and to tide over shortage needs to build reserves. Some interesting facts. Each Toyota Prius contains about 10 to 15 kg of lanthanum in its batteries. The F-35, it has already been covered, requires about 427 kgs of rare earth, and each Virginia-class nuclear submarine requires nearly 4.2 metric tons of it. Thank you.